and irrelevant, useful only for manual labor and cannon fodder in their endless wars. But the Council never asked the right question. What if humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology, their military might, or their diplomacy? What if their true power lay in something far more terrifying, their ability to simply walk away and let the consequences speak for themselves? When the last human transport ship vanished beyond the galactic rim without a word of explanation, the Council celebrated. Finally, they were free from the annoying species that always asked too many questions and refused to know their place. They had no idea that their victory party would become a funeral march for galactic civilization itself. Because sometimes, the most devastating revenge isn't war, it's absence. Seats, each one convinced of their own superiority over the others, but all united in one particular belief. Humans were the most worthless members of the galactic community. Ambassador Kethvar of the Zelthian Empire adjusted his crystalline exoskeleton and gazed down at the empty human delegation seats with satisfaction. For the first time in 200 years, those chairs remained vacant. No more listening to their endless proposals for peaceful cooperation and mutual understanding. No more enduring their primitive emotional outbursts when their suggestions were inevitably rejected. The final human transport cleared the outer rim 3 days ago, announced Council Secretary Vashtar, his tentacles writhing with barely contained glee. Among their metallic features. At last, declared Prime Counselor Zephyran, his four arms spreading wide in a gesture of liberation. The galaxy can finally progress without the constant interference of that backward species. Their emotional volatility and primitive thinking held us all back. Kethvar rose from his seat, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of accumulated disdain. Let the record show that the Zelthian Empire formally requests the immediate redistribution of all former human territories and resources. These assets are too valuable to remain unused. The chamber erupted in competing voices. Every delegation had their own claim to stake, their own piece of the human legacy they wanted to carve up and consume. The Corvani wanted the mineral-rich worlds of the outer colonies. The real question is why we tolerated their presence for so long. What did humanity ever contribute to galactic civilization? They were weak warriors, mediocre scientists, and terrible diplomats. Good riddance to dead weight. The agreement was nearly universal. For generations, the Council had watched humanity struggle to keep up with the advanced technologies and complex social structures of galactic society. Human scientists took decades to understand concepts that other species mastered in years. Their military forces were laughably small and equipped with weapons that more advanced species had abandoned centuries ago. Military Effectiveness Rating, bottom 5% among Council species. Technological Innovation Index, significantly below average. Economic contribution, minimal and declining. Diplomatic influence, negligible. They couldn't even maintain proper population control, added Councillor Yithera of the Synthetic Coalition. They reproduced based on emotional attachment rather than genetic optimization. Chaos instead of order. The criticisms continued for hours. Humans were too slow to adapt to change. They wasted resources on inefficient projects driven by sentiment rather than logic. They formed irrational attachments to outdated concepts like individual freedom and personal choice. Had eventually learned to defer to the wisdom of more advanced civilizations. They understood that the natural order placed them in subordinate roles, contributing what little they could while following the leadership of their superiors. But not humans. They had the audacity to believe they deserved equal treatment, equal votes, equal consideration. They formed alliances with other minor species, creating voting blocs that occasionally disrupted the Council's carefully planned initiatives. They asked uncomfortable questions about resource allocation and power distribution. They demanded transparency in decision-making processes that had operated smoothly in secrecy for millennia. Prime Counselor Zephran's expression darkened as he recalled some of humanity's most irritating moments. Purity Initiative, added Kethvar. A simple program to prevent the contamination of advanced bloodlines with inferior genetic material. The humans organized an entire resistance movement, spreading propaganda about basic rights and personal autonomy. They actually convinced some of our own citizens that genetic optimization was somehow wrong. The more the council members talked, the more convinced they became that humanity's departure was not just beneficial, but absolutely necessary. The galaxy needed room to grow, to evolve, to reach its true potential without being held back by the dead weight of human mediocrity. Think of what we can accomplish now, mused Counselor Drexlin. No more resources wasted on projects with no immediate practical applications. Pure, efficient scientific progress. The enthusiasm in the chamber was infectious. For the first time in centuries, the council felt truly united in purpose and vision. They began making plans immediately. Military expeditions to claim former human territories. Scientific missions to reverse engineer any potentially useful human technology. Trade agreements to divide up the economic opportunities left behind. As the session continued, a pattern emerged in their planning. Every proposal assumed that human systems would continue to function exactly as they had before, just under new management. The infrastructure humans had built would keep operating. The trade networks they had established would continue flowing. Delegations departed to their luxury accommodations. Each one carried detailed plans for claiming their share of the human legacy. Military commanders prepared deployment orders. Corporate executives drafted acquisition proposals. Scientists submitted requests for immediate access to human research facilities. None of them noticed the small discrepancies beginning to appear in their data streams. Minor glitches in communication networks. Tiny delays in information processing. Subtle inefficiencies in resource tracking systems that had been running flawlessly for centuries. The problems were so small, so seemingly insignificant, that the automated systems marked them as routine maintenance issues and scheduled them for later review. The council members slept peacefully, dreaming of a future where the galaxy could finally reach its true potential without humanity's interference. They had no idea that they had just made the worst mistake in the history of interstellar politics. Because while they had been busy cataloging human failures, they had completely missed understanding what humans had actually been doing all along. And that oversight was about to cost them everything. 3 weeks after humanity's departure, the first cracks began to show. Chief Systems Administrator Quillnex of the Ethereal Collective had been looking forward to taking over the Terran Deep Space Communication Array. It was humanity's crown jewel of infrastructure, a massive network that facilitated faster-than-light communication across 17 sectors. Cognitive abilities. Instead, he discovered something that made his plasma core flicker with confusion. The control systems weren't simple at all. They were impossibly complex, with layers upon layers of interconnected subsystems that seemed to serve no logical purpose. Redundant pathways snaked through the network in patterns that defied conventional engineering principles. Backup systems had backup systems, and those had their own backups. It was like looking at the most over-engineered piece of technology in the galaxy. "This is absurd," Quillnex muttered, his energy field brightening with frustration. Why would they build something so needlessly complicated? But the real shock came when he tried to access the system's core functions. The interfaces responded, but not in the way he expected. Optimization protocols. The first thing to go was all the redundant safety systems. Advanced species didn't need multiple layers of protection against user error. Then, he eliminated the inefficient routing pathways that seemed to zigzag through space instead of taking direct routes. Finally, he stripped out all the unnecessary backup systems that were wasting processing power. Within hours, his streamlined version was running at what his instruments showed as 300% efficiency compared to the original human design. He submitted his preliminary report with considerable pride, already imagining the commendations he would receive for improving on such primitive engineering. Obliterate entire fleets? Instead, she found a collection of modest structures that looked like they could barely withstand a strong storm, much less a serious military assault. The humans had clearly been compensating for their weakness with quantity over quality. Dozens of small outposts scattered across the sector instead of a few properly fortified strongholds. Pathetic, she clicked to her second-in-command. How did they expect to defend anything with these tin cans? But as her forces began occupying the facilities, they made some interesting discoveries. The human bases were connected by an intricate network of sensor arrays and communication relays that provided real-time information about everything happening within a 100-light-year radius. Why waste resources gathering information about worthless species? Why maintain supply routes through dangerous territories when you could simply take what you needed by force? Why establish diplomatic relationships with beings who had nothing to offer? She immediately began implementing proper Corvani military doctrine. The unnecessary sensor arrays were repurposed for more important tasks. The hidden supply routes were replaced with direct shipping lanes that saved time and resources. And, of course, those ridiculous diplomatic relationships were severed immediately. The Corvani Empire didn't negotiate with inferior species. Within days, she had transformed the entire sector into a proper military installation that operated according to logical principles instead of human emotional thinking. The Proxima Merchant Guild absorbed human trading posts and optimized their routes according to pure profit calculations, cutting out all the unprofitable stops humans had maintained for sentimental reasons. Each takeover followed the same pattern. The new management would arrive expecting to find primitive systems that could be easily improved, only to discover inexplicably complex arrangements that seemed to serve no logical purpose. But, rather than questioning their assumptions, they simply stripped away what they saw as unnecessary complications and implemented their own superior methods. The results were immediately impressive. Efficiency ratings soared across the board. Resource utilization improved dramatically. Profit margins increased exponentially. Military operational costs down by 70%. Industrial output increased by 250%. Proof positive that we should have done this centuries ago. The congratulations flowed freely. Species that had been rivals for millennia found themselves united in celebrating their collective genius. Even the normally pessimistic synthetic coalition admitted that perhaps organic species weren't completely hopeless after all, at least, not the advanced ones. But there were some voices of caution. Counselor Ythera of the Research Division had been analyzing the human systems more carefully than most, and she was beginning to notice some troubling patterns. Prime Counselor, I'm seeing some unusual characteristics in human infrastructure design. That these systems seem to have been designed to handle scenarios that our simulations suggest should never occur. It's almost like they were preparing for possibilities that don't exist. Paranoid thinking, interjected Kethvar. Humans always worried about imaginary threats. That's why they wasted so much effort on redundancy and backup systems. Fear-based engineering instead of logical optimization. The discussion continued, but Ythera found herself increasingly isolated in her concerns. Every other representative was too busy celebrating the immediate improvements to consider longer-term implications. The numbers were clear. Galactic civilization was running better than ever without human interference. Over the following days, that success story continued to build. With brutal efficiency, the Council began making grand plans for the future. Without humans around to advocate for the rights of primitive species, they could finally implement the large-scale projects that would truly advance galactic civilization. Forced evolution programs to improve the genetic quality of inferior races. Comprehensive resource extraction from underdeveloped worlds. Military campaigns to bring order to the chaotic Outer Rim territories where humans had foolishly allowed local governments to maintain independence. But, as the fourth week of the post-human era began, some of the celebrations started to feel forced. lost contact with outlying sensor arrays during routine operations. The automated industrial facilities occasionally produced quality control failures when dealing with material variations that fell outside standard parameters. Each individual incident was minor, easily dismissed as growing pains from the transition to superior management. But, taken together, they suggested a pattern that made the more analytical council members uncomfortable. It was as if the human systems had been designed to handle problems that didn't exist in normal operations but might become critical during unusual circumstances. What if, Ythera suggested during an emergency planning session, humans weren't actually bad at engineering? About to become terrifyingly clear. Because while the Council had been busy optimizing human systems for normal operations, they had unknowingly removed all the safeguards that humanity had spent centuries building to handle the abnormal ones. And in a galaxy as vast and dangerous as theirs, abnormal situations weren't just possible, they were inevitable. The crisis began on a Tuesday, Galactic Standard Time, with what appeared to be a routine solar flare in the Kepler sector. Chief Astronomer Vexilon of the Scientific Collective was monitoring the event from the newly optimized Deep Space Observatory that had once been human-operated. Compensate for the electromagnetic interference. Backup communication channels would activate if needed. Simple, logical, effective. What he didn't expect was for the flare to cascade into something far worse. The Class E event triggered a resonance effect with a nearby pulsar that human astronomers had been carefully monitoring for decades. That resonance amplified the electromagnetic pulse by a factor of 20, turning a manageable solar flare into a sector-wide communications blackout that knocked out the primary networks across 17 star systems. Impossible, Vexilon muttered as his instruments registered the escalating disaster. Them as unnecessary contingency protocols and remove them to improve efficiency. The humans hadn't just been preparing for a simple solar flare. They had been preparing for the possibility of cascade failures, resonance effects, and compound disasters that could turn routine events into civilization-threatening catastrophes. All those redundant systems and over-engineered safety measures hadn't been signs of primitive thinking. They had been insurance policies against the universe's tendency to combine unlikely events in devastating ways. As the communication blackout spread, other optimized systems across the former human territories began encountering their own impossible scenarios. Captain Thexera was the first military commander to face the real test of her streamlined defenses. Assault, but to provide advance warning and coordinated response to exactly this kind of distributed threat. The sensor networks she had repurposed were designed to detect patterns of unusual activity that could indicate organized opposition rather than random piracy. The diplomatic relationships she had severed had been sources of intelligence about enemy movements and local political conditions. Without those unnecessary preparations, her forces found themselves fighting blind against opponents who seemed to anticipate their every move. The pirates weren't just random raiders. They were part of a carefully organized resistance movement that had been planning this operation for over a year, waiting for the humans to leave and their defensive networks to be dismantled. Formal databases. They had maintained relationships with dozens of minor species who served as informal sources of information about activities in their regions. They had established trust networks that provided early warning about unusual movements or activities. They had created communication channels that allowed local populations to report suspicious behavior without fear of retaliation. All of those inefficient diplomatic relationships had actually been components of an intelligence-gathering system that was far more sophisticated than anything the Council had imagined. But because it relied on trust and voluntary cooperation rather than force and surveillance, it had been invisible to species that assumed inferior beings had nothing valuable to contribute. The disasters cascaded with terrifying speed. Adaptive manufacturing systems designed to handle exactly these variations, but those had been eliminated as overcomplicated solutions to simple problems. In the Perseus arm, trading routes that had been optimized for maximum profit began experiencing piracy and political instability as the removed and profitable diplomatic relationships had actually been maintaining peace between competing local factions. Without human mediators to resolve disputes and maintain agreements, old rivalries flared into open conflict that disrupted commerce across entire regions. For maintaining network stability during exactly the kind of rare but devastating events that were now occurring across multiple sectors simultaneously. Within 72 hours of the initial solar flare, the optimized systems that had been performing so efficiently were collapsing across the board. Communication networks that had boasted 300% efficiency improvements were now operating at 10% of their original capacity. Military installations reporting 70% cost reductions were now facing supply shortages and intelligence failures that threatened the security of entire sectors. Industrial facilities with 250% increased output were now producing defective goods that created safety hazards across their distribution networks. To strike at our newly acquired territories using advanced techniques we don't understand. But Counselor Yathera was studying the pattern of failures with growing horror as she began to understand what was really happening. Prime Counselor, I don't think this is an attack. I think this is what happens when you remove the safety systems from a universe that's inherently unpredictable. Explain. The humans didn't build inefficient systems. They built anti-fragile systems. Infrastructure designed to get stronger when exposed to stress rather than more efficient under optimal conditions. We optimized their technology for peak performance during normal operations, but we eliminated their ability to survive abnormal ones. The implications hit the Council like a physical blow. Yathera replied quietly. They're statistically inevitable if you wait long enough and operate on a galactic scale. The humans understood that in a universe this size, impossible things happen every day somewhere. They built their systems to handle impossibilities. We optimized them to handle predictabilities. As if to emphasize her point, another wave of reports arrived detailing new failures across different sectors. A routine mining operation had triggered unexpected geological instabilities that were threatening an entire star system. Automated defense systems were misidentifying friendly vessels as threats due to unusual electromagnetic signatures caused by the ongoing communication disruptions. Supply chains optimized for maximum efficiency were collapsing because they had no flexibility to handle route disruptions. Know how to fix this. But even as the words were spoken, everyone in the chamber understood the terrible truth. Humanity was gone. They had been driven away by a council that was now discovering, too late, that they had been the immune system of galactic civilization, protecting everyone from threats that were invisible until the protection was removed. And now, as cascading failures spread across former human space and threatened to destabilize the entire galactic economy, the Council faced a choice that would define the future of their civilization. Admit they had been catastrophically wrong about humanity's value, or find some other explanation for disasters that were rapidly spiraling beyond their ability to control. Worked perfectly but now seemed cursed by invisible forces. Word spread through unofficial channels about infrastructure that was collapsing for no apparent reason, about disasters that seemed to strike wherever human influence had been removed and replaced with superior management. But the most terrifying reports were the ones that weren't reaching the council at all. Communications from remote sectors where the failures had been so complete that entire regions had gone dark, leaving only silence where thriving civilizations had existed just days before. 6 weeks after humanity's departure, Ambassador Kethvar found himself doing something he had never imagined possible, begging for help from species he had spent centuries considering inferior. In the region whose infrastructure was still functioning normally. We appreciate your situation, President Veltar of the Andorians said carefully, his scaled features showing the kind of diplomatic restraint that Kethvar had never bothered to learn. But I'm afraid our resources are already stretched managing the refugee crisis. Refugee crisis. The word stung because they were accurate. Across 17 sectors, populations were fleeing failing infrastructure and collapsing systems. What had started as isolated technical problems had snowballed into civilization-wide disasters that were displacing billions of beings. Surely you understand the gravity of the situation. Kethvar. They had a different philosophy about engineering. They designed for survival rather than efficiency. Most of us assumed it was just primitive overcaution, but some of us implemented hybrid approaches just in case. The revelation was devastating. While the Council had been dismissing human engineering as wasteful and inefficient, dozens of minor species had been quietly adopting human design principles as insurance policies. They had hedged their bets, maintaining both optimized Council standard systems and backup networks built according to human specifications. Now those primitive backup systems were the only thing keeping civilization running in large parts of the galaxy. Redundant supply chains that could adapt to route disruptions. The Free Traders Guild had conflict resolution protocols that were preventing the kind of political instability that was devastating Council-optimized regions. Each stop revealed the same pattern. Species that had seemed backward and inefficient were now demonstrating remarkable resilience because they had incorporated human design philosophies into their infrastructure. Meanwhile, the most advanced Council civilizations were struggling with cascading failures that their optimized systems couldn't handle. The final blow to Kethvar's worldview came when he visited the New Geneva Station, a massive trading hub that had been built jointly by humans and several minor species. Resource distribution across 3 sectors. The primitive species that the Council had always dismissed were efficiently managing complex logistics operations that were beyond the current capabilities of Council infrastructure. Station Director Sarah Chun, one of the few humans who had remained behind to help with the transition, met him at the docking bay with the kind of professional courtesy that made his shame even more acute. "Ambassador," she said simply, "how can we help?" The question broke something inside Kethvar's carefully constructed sense of superiority. Here was a member of the species he had spent centuries dismissing, offering assistance after everything the Council had done to drive humanity away. We need to understand what went wrong," he managed. Efficiency that the Council had never managed to achieve despite centuries of supposed advancement. "This is what humanity always tried to build," Sarah explained as they watched the organized chaos of disaster response. "Systems that get stronger under pressure instead of more fragile. Networks that adapt to problems instead of breaking down when they encounter unexpected situations." Kethvar stared at the displays showing refugee movements, supply distributions, and infrastructure repairs across multiple sectors. But the efficiency ratings were so much lower than optimized systems. "Efficiency is what you get when everything goes according to plan," Sarah replied. "Resilience is what you need when everything goes wrong." Primitive thinking. They were preparations for scenarios that optimized systems couldn't handle. Seemingly inefficient diplomatic relationships weren't sentimentality. They were early warning networks and conflict resolution mechanisms. Every flaw that the Council had identified in human systems had actually been a feature designed to handle exactly the kinds of crises that were now devastating galactic civilization. "Why didn't you make us understand?" Kethvar asked desperately. "If these principles were so important, why didn't you force us to listen?" Sarah's expression showed the weariness of someone who had spent decades trying to explain concepts to people who were convinced they already knew better. "We tried, Ambassador. For centuries, we tried. We gave presentations, submitted proposals, offered demonstrations. Prepared to leave the station, Sarah handed him a data crystal. Emergency protocols, she explained. Basic principles for building resilient systems. It won't fix everything that's broken, but it might help you stabilize what's left. Why, he asked. After everything we did, why help us? Sarah smiled sadly. Because that's what humans do. We try to help, even when people don't want to be helped. It's probably why we never fit into your council in the first place. The flight back to council space gave Kethvar time to study the data crystal and confront the magnitude of his civilization's mistake. Every page of documentation revealed new layers of sophistication and human thinking that the council had completely missed. Complicated infrastructure projects. All of it had been humanity's attempt to make galactic civilization more resilient and sustainable. The Council had rejected those efforts as the meddling of inferior beings who didn't understand proper optimization. Now, as refugee ships fled failing systems across 17 sectors, Kethvar understood that humanity had been trying to save them from exactly the kinds of disasters that were now unfolding. And they had chosen to leave rather than watch their predictions come true. By the time he reached council space, Kethvar had made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He was going to tell the truth about humanity's value and the council's catastrophic misjudgment, even if it meant the end of his political career. Learned the hard way. 3 months after humanity's departure, Prime Counselor Zephyrin stood before the emergency assembly of the Galactic Council and did something that no council leader had done in over a millennium. He admitted complete and catastrophic failure. The Great Chamber was only half full. Representatives from 12 species were dealing with infrastructure collapses in their home systems. 8 more were managing refugee crises that had overwhelmed their capacity to respond. The Corvani delegation hadn't been heard from in 6 days. Their entire communication network had gone dark after a cascade failure triggered by what should have been a routine software update. The situation is beyond critical, Zephyrin announced, his forearms trembling slightly with exhaustion. Ability of their continued dominance. Now they sat in stunned recognition that their civilization was collapsing around them. Ambassador Kethvar has prepared a comprehensive analysis of the crisis, Zephyrin continued. His findings are disturbing. Kethvar rose slowly, his crystalline exoskeleton bearing stress fractures that he no longer bothered to conceal. The once proud ambassador looked like he had aged centuries in the past few weeks. Honored colleagues, he began, his voice carrying none of its former arrogance. We were wrong. About everything. About humanity. About efficiency. About what it takes to maintain civilization in a chaotic universe. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of discomfort throughout the chamber. This was not how advanced species were supposed to speak. under optimal conditions. Every redundancy we eliminated, every safety protocol we streamlined, every backup system we dismissed as unnecessary, they were all essential components of a survival strategy we were too arrogant to understand. Counselor Drexloan of the hegemony shifted uncomfortably. You're suggesting that inferior species somehow developed superior technology without our knowledge? That's impossible. No, Kethvar replied quietly. I'm suggesting that we defined superiority incorrectly. We measured advancement by efficiency during optimal conditions. Humans measured advancement by survival during catastrophic ones. In a universe that operates on chaos as much as order, their metric was more accurate. He activated a holographic display that showed the current state of galactic civilization. Traditional measures, Kethvar explained. They're the species that were humble enough to learn from humanity instead of dismissing them. The Andorian Trade Federation, the Centauri Cooperative, the Frontier Worlds Alliance. All of them incorporated human design principles into their infrastructure. All of them are now serving as refugee centers and relief coordination hubs. The implications were devastating. The primitive species that the Council had always looked down upon were now the backbone of galactic civilization, while the most advanced civilizations were collapsing because they had optimized away their ability to handle unexpected problems. Secretary Vashtar raised a trembling tentacle. What about contacting them? The humans? Drexloan demanded. This affects the entire galaxy. Why should they? The voice came from an unexpected source, Counselor Ythera, who had been quietly analyzing data throughout the discussion. We spent centuries telling them they were inferior. We rejected every offer of cooperation. We celebrated when they left. Why should they risk their own survival to save civilizations that treated them as worthless? The question hung in the air because everyone knew the answer. From humanity's perspective, the galaxy had gotten exactly what it had demanded, a chance to prove it could do better without human interference. The fact that this experiment was failing catastrophically was not humanity's responsibility to fix. There has to be something we can do, Zefran said desperately. Before. Full autonomy to organize galactic infrastructure according to their own principles instead of council mandates. The silence that greeted this suggestion was profound. What Kethvar was proposing wasn't just admitting mistakes. It was surrendering power to species that the council had always considered subordinate. They want to implement human design principles on a galactic scale, he continued. Decentralized networks instead of centralized control. Regional autonomy instead of uniform standards. Collaborative decision-making instead of hierarchical authority. Everything we've always rejected as inefficient and primitive. Impossible, Drexloan growled. The Council exists to provide order and guidance to lesser species. Reports arrived detailing new failures and expanding disasters. Even the most conservative council members began to understand that their choice was simple. Surrender control to the species that were successfully managing the crisis, or watch galactic civilization collapse entirely. The vote, when it finally came, was not close. 43 species voted to grant emergency powers to the surviving infrastructure networks. Only 3 voted against. The Galactic Council, for the first time in its 3,000-year history, acknowledged that other species might be better qualified to lead. The transition began immediately. Most importantly, communication channels were opened with every species in the galaxy, including the minor civilizations that the Council had always ignored. Information networks were established based on cooperation rather than authority. Decision-making processes were decentralized to allow regional autonomy while maintaining coordination. It was exactly the kind of system that humanity had tried to convince the Council to adopt for centuries. 6 months later, the crisis had stabilized. Infrastructure was functioning again across most of the galaxy, though built according to very different principles than before. The refugee crisis was largely resolved, with billions of beings relocated to new homes and systems designed for sustainability rather than efficiency. The galaxy is stronger now than it was when we left. If you're ever ready to build something truly cooperative together, you know how to reach us. Prime Counselor Zephyran read the message privately in his office, surrounded by the remnants of a civilization that had been rebuilt by principles he had once dismissed as primitive. The irony was complete. In trying to exclude humanity from galactic civilization, the Council had forced the galaxy to learn the very lessons that humanity had been trying to teach all along. The humans hadn't left in defeat. They had left as teachers whose students were finally ready to graduate. Refused to protect themselves. But they watched and waited and hoped that someday the galaxy might be ready for the kind of partnership they had always wanted to offer. The choice, as it had always been, was up to the galaxy to make. But this time, at least, the galaxy was finally wise enough to choose correctly.